Thutmose left the Nile with a scowl. He was still afflicted with boils and sores. His humiliation must be assuaged. He seated himself on his throne on a plump cushion. "Call for the magicians," he said to a servant. After a few minutes the servant returned to the throne room and bowed low, aware that additional soldiers were now present. "Great and mighty Pharaoh," began the trembling servant. "Where are they?" growled Pharaoh. "The magicians are lying down." Pharaoh gestured with a sideways jerk of his head, and the soldiers marched from the room. "Get out of my sight!" he yelled to the servant, who obeyed in haste. Cries broke out in the magicians' chambers as swords came down on their necks. Hippoware lay on his bed, cringing. Who would be next? Pharaoh was clearly no god, and he was covered with boils and unable to stop the plagues, but Moses' God was powerful. Moses sought God. "Stretch out your hand over Egypt, and the locusts will come to destroy everything left by the hail," instructed God. Moses stretched out his staff over the land, and God brought an east wind all day and night. During the night, Hippoware climbed out of his window and dropped to the ground, carrying a sack full of his belongings. He wore a cloak. Grit blew into his eyes. He knew this was the onset of another plague from Moses' God, perhaps a deadly dust storm. He stealthily wended his way towards Goshen, where all was calm and still. He'd heard that they weren't suffering, but now he saw it with his own eyes. He inhaled some clean air, taking deep breaths. He began to revive from the soreness in his body from the boils. Then he headed east. The Hebrews conversed in their houses. Others walked in the streets. Hippoware asked a man in Hebrew, "Apho Moshe?" "His tent is near the border to the east, but he is not at home, Egyptian." "Why are you spying us out? It's not our fault. Don't blame us." The man walked away and headed to his friend's house to tell him about the spy. They began to follow Hippoware. Moses and Aaron had broken down the gate to the compound around Joseph's palace, which the Egyptians had sealed up years ago. They met inside the palace with the elders. Hippoware wandered around with his face now covered by a hood. There were voices nearby, and he headed toward the sound. "Joseph's old palace has light," he said to himself, and began to move closer. Then he saw two men guarding the entrance. He snuck around the compound wall, stacked some stones beside it, hauled himself over and dropped into the compound. He ducked as he ran to a window and sat beneath it on the ground. "Egypt is finished," he heard a man say. "They know it," said Moses. "Or rather, the servants do. Pharaoh is deluded." One of the Hebrew guards found Hippoware, having heard some sounds. He ran towards him and shouted, "You there!" Hippoware stood up and held his hands out from his body, palms open. A second man came running and they grabbed him. Aaron appeared at the window. "What's happening?" "An Egyptian spy!" "Bring him to us." "I'm not a spy," said Hippoware, as they began to lead him around the wall of the palace. In the courtyard they met Moses coming out from between the 12 pillars of Jacob in the portico. The elders and Aaron followed. The two men that had followed Hippoware also arrived behind the guards. "Who are you?" asked Moses. "Hippoware, a scribe of Pharaoh." "He's too puny to be a soldier," agreed one of the guards, holding his arm. Hippoware was short and wiry. He was nearly offended with the Hebrew, but was inclined to agree. "Why are you snooping around?" Suddenly Moses recognized Hippoware. They looked into each other's faces up close for the first time. One of the guards was holding the bag of Hippoware's belongings. "What's in that bag?" asked Moses. "My possessions," answered Hippoware. "I have left the palace where your God is punishing everyone." "Search the bag," Moses instructed a guard. "Do you seek refuge?" Moses asked. "I want to find out what is happening to my country." "The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is punishing the wicked," said one of the elders. "He does wonders to destroy you." Moses held up his hand for silence. "Pharaoh rules as a man and not a god," he explained. "He must let the Hebrews go into the wilderness to serve our God." "There are no weapons in the bag, but there is a papyrus with writing on it," said the guard, who handed the papyrus to Moses. It appeared to be a private journal. Moses kept it. "Give back the rest of his things. By morning, Pharaoh will be busy chasing locusts. 2 of you escort this man out of Avaris." "We will go," said one of the men who had been following Hippaware. Moses nodded and waved for them all to leave. Hippaware walked with the 2 Hebrews towards the eastern border of Goshen. He stopped there and said to them, "Joseph I know of, but tell me about Abraham, Isaac and Jacob." Moses and Zipporah sat on the rug in their tent the next morning at breakfast. Their 2 sons had eaten and were running around outside with some Hebrew children. Moses was looking at the staff of God, just a length of tree limb, and yet. Zipporah smiled at Moses, who smiled back tiredly. "No colour distinction," said Zipporah, nodding towards the children. "Of course not. These are my people," said Moses. Zipporah snorted. "What does that mean?" "Your sister Miriam says that I am blacker than the tents of the nomads." Moses gaped for a moment, then with a gleam said, "Well, you are." He laughed. Zipporah smiled at his teasing and tossed a handy scrap of bread at him. "Miriam gets jealous sometimes. Don't take it to heart." "I will get my 6 sisters to meet her sometime," threatened Zipporah. "No, don't scare her," said Moses. Zipporah leaned over to Moses and kissed his lips. "I think she is also offended by my bare breasts." Moses smiled. "Like the Egyptian women's? Then why don't you wear that lovely long dress you brought with you?" "It's too warm, but maybe tonight at Miriam's home." "I'll take you and the children to see Joseph's palace, if you like," said Moses. "Thank you, my man. We will look forward to that." "And I want to go home, too. But the change of scene has been good in a way, and I made some friends. The children want to get closer to those enormous pyramids." "Not possible," said Moses firmly. "Oh," said Zipporah imploringly. Gershon ran into the tent. "Father, Mother, come see." They went outside. "What is it?" asked Gershon, pointing to the sky. All the children were looking up at a cloud of insects heading towards them. "It's locusts," answered Moses. "What a racket," said Zipporah. "Here they come," said Gershon, as the locusts began to pass overhead. They all stood watching as they headed towards the Egyptians. The locusts devoured what was left of the crops, the first harvest of the year. Funnily enough, all that remained was chaff to remind Pharaoh of his punishment of the Hebrews. One night, soon after, Zipporah awoke to distant screams of terror from the Egyptians. She sat up and listened in the dark. Moses was already awake. Gershon asked, "What is it, Mother?" She turned to look at Moses. "Go to sleep," he said. "The Egyptians are afraid of a darkness from God." "It's all right. The Lord makes a distinction between his people and the Egyptians." "I'm not afraid of the dark," said their youngest son. Zipporah chuckled and lay down. But Moses said, "It's a deep misery of emptiness." Not understanding, Gershon said, "And you can't see!" After 3 days, the black mist departed Egypt. The Egyptians wept for relief. They were convinced that Moses' God was causing the plagues. Pharaoh called for Moses. "You and your people go 3 days into the wilderness as you asked, but your flocks and herds you will leave here," said Pharaoh. "We will take our flocks and herds, because until we get to the place we don't know what God requires," answered Moses, adding, "And give to us sacrifices and burnt offerings, for the Lord our God." Pharaoh's face darkened. "You are dishonourable! You lie! Get out of my sight, you filthy Hebrew! The day we meet again will be your last." Once outside the palace, many Egyptians bowed low to Moses as he passed by.